Passengers from the poorest emigrant to the richest millionaire made their way here to meet the ship, and hundreds of crew signed on. Len has come to the city to discover how communities here suffered the greatest number of deaths when Titanic sank.
This is the dock where Titanic took on her first paying passengers. She filled up with coal, water and food, and the crew came on board, and about 700 of them came from right here in Southampton. So when news of the sinking reached the city, the streets were filled with dread.
By midnight, Titanic was sinking, but many of her crew stuck to their posts and helped passengers to safety, until around 2:15 a.m, when the ship disappeared beneath the waves. Survival time in the freezing water was just minutes. Anxious families gathered outside the offices of the White Star Line in Southampton, desperate for news. More often than not, when the news did arrive, it was bad. 3/4 of Titanic's crew were dead.
Children lost their fathers, women lost their husbands, brothers and sons. The whole town was in mourning.
The community around the dock wasn't just devastated with grief, it also faced poverty.
There were 880 odd crew. Of those, more than 600 odd were living in Southampton. 549 of them didn't survive. And these are the dock communities. This is the old town. Each of those red dots is a crew member who was lost. If you weren't directly affected, then you knew somebody who did.
Yeah.
You were related to somebody who did, your child went to school with somebody who did.
Yeah.
It was something that affected every member of the community.
The city archives hold recordings of men and women remembering the aftermath of Titanic.
A great hush descended on the town because I don't think that there was hardly a single street in Southampton who hadn't lost somebody on that ship.
Yeah, I remember ever so plain. The girl at school used to come and say, come and down the dock gate. Me and my sister used to go down the dock gate to see if her father's name was up there. There's several girls at school had fathers on there. Or brothers or something, some relation.
You know, when you listen to these people reminiscing about their childhood, and it's just very, very poignant, and it just makes you feel, it just takes you back somehow, 100 years. Nowhere was Titanic's death toll felt more sharply than on the streets of Southampton. More victims came from here than anywhere else in the world. A charity was set up for victims' families, and donations flooded in from across Southampton. Memorials to Southampton's Titanic dead are dotted around the city. Some crew did survive and found it impossible to put Titanic behind them. Mandy Reeves' great-great-grandfather was a boot steward on board. He lived, but was left traumatised.
He suffered terrible sleep sweats, and he would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, saying that all he could hear was the screams in the water, and he felt guilty to be alive.
Philip Littlejohn's grandfather, Alexander, was a first-class steward from Southampton. The months following the disaster were torture. So your grandfather did survive?
Yes, survived the sinking, but the effects on his life afterwards were very apparent. That, before the accident, within 6 months, he then looked like that.
So,
Purely through the effects of shock.
how old was he?
40 in both pictures.
That is incredible. Just as extraordinary is the way the White Star Line treated the crew who survived the sinking.
The other thing we need here is his discharge book, which recorded all his voyages, including the 13th voyage of the White Star Line, the Titanic. Engaged 10th of April 1912 in Southampton and discharged the 15th of April at sea. Where discharge read the sack. In other words, as the ship went down, they sacked the lot of them.
almost beyond belief that this could happen.
In fact, when they reached New York, they were penniless. White Star washed their hands of them, and Woolworths let them stand behind the counters, and whatever they took in the day, they could spend on food and clothes. So thanks to Woolies, my grandfather got food and clothes.
Is that really what happened?
Absolutely true.
The families of crew who died were eventually compensated, but there was no bringing back the loved ones who had been lost.
But what Southampton shows us is that the tragedy of Titanic isn't just about those who died that night. It's about thousands of other people as well.
Parents, wives, children, and the survivors themselves were all faced with the struggle to rebuild their lives in the wake of the giant ship.
Titanic's death